Welcome. I would like to start by introducing myself and the others with me today. My name is Jack Oliveira, and I am the business manager of Labor's Local 183. We are the biggest construction local in North America and based here in the GTA, Cobourg, and Barrie. I'm joined by the author of our report, Economist John O'Grady. I'm also pleased to introduce one of the three members of our local who are featured in our report, Diego Campione. Also here today are members of Local 183's Executive Board. They are here because no issue is more important to us than this one. We are here today to release a report by economist John O'Grady that addresses directly and forcefully the dangers of the right-to-work laws proposed by Tim Hudak's conservatives. Our report is called Right to Work, Putting the Middle Class Out of Reach. I will go even further. Right to work is an attack on the middle class and an attack on unions. In states that have adopted laws like these ones, the Tories are proposing wages decreased for everyone. As union wages decline, employers everywhere reduce pay. Our report dismantles the Tories' research piece by piece. Local 183 is a construction union. As a job creator, the construction sector is a huge success story. We create jobs at a rate much higher than the provincial average. In 2013, it was 8% higher. We have a better success rate for apprentices completing training at our union education centers. Our completion rate is 75% versus individual employers whose rate is 58%. We have fewer workplace injuries. A study of WSIB data in 2000 showed union sites have half of the injuries of non-union sites. We pay a middle-class wage. A career construction worker can afford to raise and educate a family and own a home. Why does Tim Hudak want to cut our wages and take these benefits away? What does he have against hardworking men and women? Why would he deny them a middle-class life? I will now turn the floor over to John O'Grady, who can answer any questions about the report. I believe Diego would also be pleased to answer any questions you would have for him.
Overall, your findings.
Surely. As Jack mentioned, the motivation for the study was to respond to the Conservative Party's platform for changing labor relations. Those changes, while they're sometimes portrayed as bringing in American right-to-work laws, in fact, they're actually well to the right even of that legislation. The proposals that are in the Conservative Party platform are actually more regressive even than the labor legislation that you would find in states like Alabama or Mississippi, which are poster boys for so-called right-to-work legislation. And it's a transparent double standard. What the conservative proposals would do is attack the very heart of the capacity of trade unions to implement dues collection at rates that are approved by their membership. But the proposals would only attack the capacity of unions to implement that kind of a dues policy. It would leave completely untouched the ability of professional associations like the Ontario Medical Association, the Law Society of Upper Canada, the dentists, the engineers, to levy compulsory fees. Evidently, in Mr. Hudak's vision for Ontario, collective bargaining and compulsory dues for doctors is quite okay, but not for ordinary working people. The reality is that the workplace in Ontario, frankly everywhere, is a very unequal place. Power is unequal between the ordinary worker and his or her employer. Collective bargaining brings some balance to that relationship. And it has enabled really many hundreds of thousands of very ordinary working people to move into the middle class through the improved wages, improved working conditions, and improved benefits, economic security that result from collective bargaining. That's especially true in the construction industry. And in the report there are three examples of individuals who personify the benefits that have flowed to their families from collective bargainings. You can see examples of the impact of the skills training that the union movement does in the construction industry, the economic security benefits that arise from their benefit plans, and of course the incremental improvements in wages. All of that's put at risk by attacking the very foundation, the economic foundation of collective bargaining. The smokescreen for that is a promise that if Ontario were to import, indeed go further to the right even than the United States, or some of the American states in its labor legislation, there would somehow miraculously be an increase in the number of manufacturing jobs. And so there's reference that is made to a study that was done by the Fraser Institute, which basically says that if Ontario adopted right-to-work laws, then there would be an increase in 59,000 manufacturing jobs. When you put that claim under the microscope, it doesn't look very persuasive. I mean, first of all, the 59,000 jobs comes after over a period of 25 years. Now, that's a very long forecast to have any confidence in. Think back on the changes that we've seen in 25 years. The internet, nanotechnology, biotechnology, the fall of the Soviet bloc, NAFTA, the commodity price boom, all of those are factors that 25 years ago one would not have forecast. How anyone can have confidence in a forecast that goes out 25 years and requires such a forecast in order to come up with any significant benefits is frankly beyond me. When you look at the American states that have adopted right to work, and there are 22 of those, they're mostly in the South and the Southwest, they have on average wages that are about 16.6% below the average wages in the states which have not adopted that legislation. So to simply get to the bottom line, right-to-work legislation is about putting in place a system of labor relations that keeps wages down. That's its purpose. The impact of right-to-work legislation on manufacturing jobs is actually quite interesting to look at. And one of the best examples to look at is the state of Oklahoma, because it was a relatively recent adopter of right-to-work legislation. And when its governor promoted that legislation, he did so very specifically on the same claim that inspires the Conservative platform, which is an increase in manufacturing jobs. So Oklahoma adopted right-to-work legislation in 2001. And if you have a chance to look through the report, you'll see there at page 16 a graph of the manufacturing employment in Oklahoma. And what it shows you is that prior to the adoption of right-to-work legislation, manufacturing employment in Oklahoma was growing. Obviously, the government's intention was to accelerate and maintain that growth. And yet, in fact, the exact opposite happened. Manufacturing jobs declined after the introduction of right-to-work, and that was before the recession of 2008. In other words, there's really no evidence whatsoever that right-to-work legislation in and of itself can stimulate manufacturing employment. Indeed, the evidence seems to be that it's at best irrelevant, possibly even negative. And certainly, since right-to-work legislation has its effect by keeping wages down, the only kind of manufacturing industries that are attracted by that strategy are industries that are looking for low wages. And believe me, if you're in the manufacturing sector and you're looking for low wages, Ontario is not at the top of your list and is never going to be at the top of your list. You're going to be looking at Latin America or at South Asia or at Southeast Asia. The kinds of manufacturing industries that would be attracted to a jurisdiction like Ontario are industries that are involved in advanced manufacturing and technology and skills-intensive manufacturing. And if you listen to what the Council of Chief Executive Officers in the manufacturing industry is saying here in Canada, it's not that wages are the problem. What they're promoting is a skills agenda and an infrastructure agenda. Those are the keys in a modern economy to supporting the manufacturing sector. Mr. Hudak's platform is just so dated in its strategy and so destructive in its effects.
Could you talk a bit more about Oklahoma? My recollection of the early 2000s was that it was also a time where the Americans brought in steel tariffs, for example, that hurt automakers. I realize there's always going to be a bunch of different factors at play here, but a bit more specifically, I mean, how did the right-to-work legislation that was brought in affect the manufacturing jobs there?
I think the short answer is it probably didn't have any effect. That it's the right-to-work legislation has at best a moderate impact, if any, on incumbent firms. They already have a wage structure. The right-to-work legislation would weaken the subsequent bargaining power of a union if there is one. And so down the road, conceivably, some benefits to the company might arise. But the economic case that is made for right-to-work legislation is at the margin, at the new companies that will come in because they're attracted to that environment. And the evidence from Oklahoma is that didn't persuade anybody. In fact, other factors were clearly so much more important that you saw an exodus of manufacturing jobs that was largely driven by offshoring in 2001. So that if the purpose of the strategy was to attract manufacturing companies that would come because of the prospect of low wages, they had a better answer to that, which is we can find even lower wages offshore.
You mentioned that the Ontario policies go beyond what some of the U.S. states are doing. Could you be more explicit? What in the Ontario PC white paper goes beyond what you might see?
Yes. Well, the simple essence of right-to-work legislation in the American model is that dues payment is voluntary on the part of a worker in a company. So historically in Ontario, up until I think it's the mid-70s, the date is in the report, dues, whatever dues were, the arrangement for dues in a workplace was a matter for negotiation between a union and an employer. And there were various configurations that you saw, from compulsory dues payment to compulsory dues payment for all new employees, but existing employees, it was optional. They could opt in or opt out. It was a one-time choice. You saw various configurations. And then in the mid-70s, Ontario amended the Labour Relations Act, as frankly did every other jurisdiction in Canada, which said that if a union proposed compulsory dues, that is to say all workers in the workplace would pay the dues, then the employer had to agree to that. So it essentially became non-negotiable on the union's application. So in the narrowest sense, what right to work does is just remove that section of the Labour Relations Act. And that would basically be going back to the American model. Next step is in the right to work states. Unions are prohibited from negotiating compulsory dues deduction. And so the first regime is we can negotiate it, but it's not a statutory right. Next regime is prohibited from negotiating it. But there is still dues deduction for those workers who agree to have dues deduction. What Mr. Hudak would do is go one step even further. He would say, even if workers agree to dues deduction, they can't have it through payroll deduction unless the employer agrees. And in the public sector, employers will be barred from agreeing. Now, that doesn't even exist, to my knowledge, in any of the American states.
One of the things that Mr. Hudak talks a lot about is the money that the unions do collect through unions do, and he would like to see some reports on how that money is being spent. So would that be something that your union would be willing to do?
Jack?
All our monies basically are approved through our membership before they're being spent. So, you know, we hold monthly meetings and basically go through the finances, and everything is very transparent there.
It seems like not all unions are like that.
You know what, we're here on behalf of the Labor's Local 183 and LiUNA, and basically that's how our constitution works, and we go by it, so.
Virtually every union that I'm aware of has its accounts audited by a CA firm, and those audited statements are available to the members. Given that there's a lot of members, that effectively puts the information in public domain.
One of the points that the PCs like to make is that unions may force their members to have their dues involved in political campaigns that may go against their own personal views. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Well, so does every corporation that from which I buy goods or services force me to contribute to their political action fund, supporting positions which I may not be in agreement with.
You talked about this as an attack on the middle class, but I mean, in the private sector, unions make up like 1 in 5, 1 in 6 workers. Has the province moved beyond unions as a bulwark of the middle class, do you think? Either of you?
It's certainly true there's been a significant decline of unionization in the private sector. That's predominantly driven by the decline in traditional smokestack manufacturing jobs. So even though manufacturing output is higher than it was 20 years ago in value-added terms, the employment base that's required for that is of course substantially lower. There are a number of industries in the private sector, and construction is front and center, in which the trade union movement still plays a very central role, not only in establishing the appropriate wages and working conditions for its own members, but by a demonstration effect having implications for the entire construction labor market. So even where you've got fair wage schedules at municipal, provincial, or federal level, those are picking up in some way the impact of trade unions on wages and working conditions in the construction sector. So for many industries, and in particular the construction industry, collective bargaining and unions still play a very, very central role.
Thank you.
Thank you.